The dawn of the Q-Line era is nearly here, but where should expectations be when rail isn't always working in other cities? And should mobility start moving above the ground? Uber thinks so, and a Detroit company is trying to take flight. Today is Sunday, April 30th, 2017, and this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. We have arrived at the last day of April, and the month of May brings the long-awaited launch of the Q-Line in Detroit. This week, a number of VIPs got a test run, and for the rest of us, it all starts May 12th, less than 2 weeks away. We've watched this taking shape for so long, and so many have fought for this piece of mobility that many hope is the start of a bigger and broader rail presence. At the very least, it's hoped that it'll help create real connective tissue between the news center and Midtown and then downtown. But where should our expectations be? A new piece of online reporting casts some shadow on the project by looking at the experiences of other cities that have recently joined the rail brigade. Ridership hasn't always matched predictions, and in some instances, the rail cars seem to spend more time in the shop than on the rails. In Atlanta, for example, the system has proved to be too unreliable. It led to a city councilwoman to remark that at its great cost, it would have been better to pay for everyone's Uber rides than to fund what they call the Beltline. Coming up this morning, Steve Neveling of Motor City Muckraker will detail what he's found by digging into the nation's rail choices. But maybe, like Uber, you think mobility needs to get off the ground, and I mean that literally. This past week at the Uber Elevate Summit in Dallas, the conversation steered toward, well, flying cars. And a Detroit company is squarely in that conversation. The CEO of Detroit Aircraft is here to give us the world that George Jetson might well appreciate. And this week, Mayor Duggan headed to Lansing to tell lawmakers the city has its financial house in order and that it's time to come out from under state oversight. Is it? It's all this morning on Flashpoint. All right, less than 2 weeks to go before the launch of the Q-Line. An awful lot of excitement. A lot of people got to try it out this past week, but what are we really getting? Steve Neveling of the MotorCityMuckraker.com online site has been doing an awful lot of reporting. Two pieces have run so far. The next one will be coming up this next week. And you've been examining the experience of other cities in starting a rail line. It's not great, Steve.
No, it's not. I was really interested to see, and I took 6 months really researching this and getting public records so I could get a really full look at how well these modern streetcars were working. The problem was when M-Line went to get the money, there were only 2 modern streetcar systems in the country. So there wasn't a way to look at really good way to figure out, were these really functional, how were they working, how can we make them better, et cetera. So President Obama comes along and he offers up $300 million to all these cities for a modern streetcar system. Since then, we now have an additional 9 from that money that have been running. A lot
more experience to look at.
Yes, a lot more experience to look at.
And the experience for most of those cities has been?
It's been disastrous, to be honest. I mean, the streetcars are slow, they're unreliable, they're accident prone. They tend to get stuck anytime there's a car blocking. The problem is that when you're looking at a bus, for example, and you're getting on a bus, you expect that bus to be there on a certain schedule, especially if you're going to be taking it to work, to lunch, or just any other, if you have an appointment. Well, with the streetcars, there's so many problems that can occur that if there's just one car, blocking a streetcar lane, that messes up the entire. It just messes up the entire track.
It's interesting. Well, clearly, we're going to have an education for all of us who drive in Detroit to learn how to coexist with these things. Same thing for people on bicycles, because the rails are an interesting problem there as well. But the other part of this experience that you've seen is the costliness of it. You've got a city council member in Atlanta looking at their system that is now very underused compared to what the projections were. And I believe her quote was, yes, if we'd known it was going to cost this much, we would have been better off just buying everybody Uber rides.
Yeah, exactly what she said. And you know, that wasn't hyperbole. That system there is so bad. They had lax safety procedures. They had a ton of accidents. Mechanical problems all over the place. Their overhead wires weren't working. I mean, it seems like anything that was supposed to work just wasn't working, and people have realized this is not a way to rely on transportation.
And this system that we're using in Detroit is the exact same one as they're using in Dallas, which has spent, the cars seem to spend a lot of time in the shop.
Yeah, actually Dallas is the worst city for streetcars in the country, and they're running the exact same one in Detroit. And what's interesting is Dallas said, hey, we have this about a mile long part of a track where we can't put up overhead lines. Is it possible that you can come up with some kind of hybrid system? And at the time, there were only 2 or 3 in the whole world that operated, the streetcars that operated like that, where that was operated off patio power. So what happened was they were able to get the system, and the Brookville, the company that made them out of Pennsylvania, which is the same one that's making them in Detroit, sent them over these hybrids. And the hybrids are just disasters. The batteries aren't working when they go offline. The batteries will stall. They've had so many problems that in 7 months, they have stalled 70 times and had to be taken out of service. So an average of 10 times a month. 10 times a month, yeah. Now, some people would say, your website is called Muckraker. You're just kind of being a killjoy. Yeah. But I want to point out, you've been down there taking pictures. You've been excited about this streetcar to begin with. Yeah, I mean, there's a part of me that's really excited about this. These are really sleek, fun-looking cars. But I mean, they run along a pre-existing bus route. So they're going to be competing with cars, buses, in the same lane. So it's going to be very difficult to justify. As
opposed to rapid transit bus lines that have designated lanes.
And sort of the bus rapid transit, and how this could have originally been, how this money could have been spent, was on something where more Detroiters could have been able to use it. Because right now, only 3% of Detroiters actually have access to a bus stop that stops every 10 or 15 minutes. 26.5% of Detroiters don't have access to a car. So here we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a technology from the 19th century and putting it on a modern road so that people can be ferried from one end of downtown.
I suppose some would say, though, that the problem with comparing Detroit's situation with any other city is that we are unlike any other city when it comes to transit. We needed to start somewhere, to start something that resembles modern transportation and mobility.
Yeah, and I think they could have done that with the bus rapid transit. They could definitely have done it with that.
Which just doesn't, though, seem as sexy to some people.
Right, it might not, but it's not sexy for the people, the thousands and thousands of people who can't get rides to work, or who lose their jobs because they can't get to work because of a reliable system. I don't think that we should be talking about having this sort of nostalgia-wrapped toy that doesn't go anywhere and funding a lot of that money, when we could be using that money for Detroiters to actually use, to actually get to and from work and to a doctor's appointment.
As I mentioned, Steve has done 2 parts of his reporting so far. The 3rd part will appear this coming week. We'll link to Motor City Muckraker on clickondetroit.com, or you can head to Motor City Muckraker and check out the reporting. Steve, thanks very much for being here this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Always good to have you here. We'll bring in the round table, let them weigh in on that, as well as some of the other news of the week. Stay with us. This is Flashpoint on Local 4. Welcome back, Flashpoint. Let's continue on this theme of what we expect of the Q line, which, as I mentioned earlier, opens to the public now less than 2 weeks from now. Good to have with us this morning Portia Roberson, who had a very interesting week as the head of the Civil Rights Department for the city. We'll talk about that coming up in just a minute. Keith Owens is here, senior editor, for the Michigan Chronicle, and Nolan Finley, editorial page chief of the Detroit News. Nolan, I think Steve Niebling is raising some really troubling issues. Maybe our expectations need to be in a different place for the Q line. What are you thinking?
Well, I think the people who paid for the Q line, and you have to look at this project in a little different light than you would most municipal transportation projects, because it was financed largely through private dollars and will be operated with private dollars. I think they are extremely incentivized to make sure this thing works, because it's their money on the line. I mean, this thing's going to open May 12th regardless. The cars are bought, the track's laid. There's no going back at this point. And I think the folks who built it are rather pleased with the development and the investment they're already seeing along that route. Just yesterday you had another midtown, or last week, another midtown, major midtown development announced. The property that's being bought up and developed along that route is sort of vindication for them even before it opens. I was skeptical in the beginning of whether a 3-mile line would make much difference, and I think that still remains to be seen. But the people who are putting money in Detroit believe in it.
Keith, it has made a difference in just the way that we had been told, if you build it, they will come, and the way that development has worked along that route. In that sense, it has. But I don't think that anybody wants this to be more attraction than function, and I guess that's what the question was.
Well, I think that is the question. I mean, in terms of, granted, it has drawn the investment and people are hoping that it will work, but then the question is, once again, will it work? In other words, now that the money is there, we don't want to see the same things happen that were seen in Steve Neveling's article, in terms of it happening in other cities, some pretty dramatic things. I mean, I've said before, I'm originally from Denver, Colorado, and mass transit there is beautiful. So it works quite well. But
one of the places actually that they visited when they were trying to design these systems.
Right, so they work quite well, but I think that also the troubling thing is it's the same company that has not worked in other cities is the one that we have here. Obviously, Nolan's right, they're very incentivized to want to make this work. I mean, I think also for another reason we want to see it work is that hopefully, because right now this is a very small line. This only helps to get from point A to point B. It's not going around the region. But if it attracts riders, does well, that may give more incentive to stretch it out to original intent.
Of you concerned?
Well, obviously I have some concerns. I mean, Steve raised some very interesting points about what is happening in some of the streetcars around the country. I also think that, of course, we need more functional transportation and transit lines in the city. I've always been a fan of bus rapid transit. Again, it's not as sexy as maybe a streetcar, but I think it moves a lot of people and it can go down major thoroughfares. It probably does. I think the one thing we have to make sure we don't do is see this as a solution and not start continuing to think about transit on a larger scale to continue to do things simultaneously to this. We're going to open the Q line in 2 or so weeks. Okay, so what's going to be the next thing that we do? So let's not think about this is going to solve any problems. Let's just continue to think about how can we develop other mass transit to get people around the city of Detroit in the southeast region.
We could call it a rolling subway.
There you go. Let's move to the mayor's visit to Lansing this past week, Keith. There were a lot of strings attached as the city emerged from bankruptcy. The mayor's trying to argue now that those strings have become ropes that are keeping the city from moving forward, and they feel like they can show enough evidence that the city is on a good footing now to move away from the oversight from Lansing. Right.
Well, I think the mayor has been telegraphing that for a while, that this was the end goal, end game for a while, and I think that he's made good on a lot of the promises that he wants. I mean, in terms of the budgets, being on time, and said another progress has been made in the city, and obviously it's an election year as well. I mean, so that I think
that wasn't lost on you. That this might be your request for election.
That may also quite be, obviously a part of it. So neighborhoods are in that, but I think that. But I believe that does factor into it. But I think he also has some obvious reason to want to get that off of the city's back, because that's also obviously been on the minds of the people in Detroit. I mean, who did not want the bankruptcy in the first place, but now that it's here to get that shackle off of them of financial oversight means a lot to a lot of people.
Nolan?
I might want to wait and see who wins in November before start pulling that trigger. But, I think
look at the naughty twinkle in your eyes.
I think the state should have should be involved only where it absolutely needs to be involved, in local community school districts around the state. The city seems to be functioning well. Its books are balanced at the moment. I think they could afford to end this oversight early. He's asking for it to be ended early next year, I think. And so if you get to if you get to that point and the books look good, it's a simple matter of pulling that back.
I agree.
Low-hanging fruit for the woman who works for the mayor.
Because of course I agree that it's time. Yeah, I've never been a fan of oversight anyways, but nevertheless, I think that the city has proven that they are going in the right direction and that things are working and starting to work now, and there's no real credible reason why I think the state can continue to say we have to be an oversight committee to what's happening there.
Yeah. Keith, before I want to let Portia tell us about her week, but I also want to quickly mention, so we've got a superintendent coming for the school district. Yes. Is that going to ease a lot of the anger that we had from a lot of residents over Alicia Merriweather's exclusion from being one of the finalists, do you think?
Well, I don't think it'll ease the anger right away. I mean, because some of the anger was that she was not, not considered because she's been doing the job for a year, and so, and I felt also that her name should at least been on the list. But I think, but now that he's in there, I mean, he's very qualified and he's from the area. I think that, so hopefully he will do well. I think that at this point, the main thing now is to keep the children in mind and keep the kids in mind in terms of what they need and what needs to be done. So I think, so whether or not, but the short answer is, I don't think automatically by Mr. Vitti coming in that anger is going to tamper down at that. So he has a big job ahead of him.
Nicola Vitti coming in from Florida. Now I want to get to your week that you had. We found out that Mark Zuckerberg was in town on Friday, spent some time at Ford, then spent a lot of time in the city, and then come to find out you were his tour guide.
I was his tour guide.
Do tell.
Do tell. So through my Obama alum family, I got a call to reach out to someone who was looking for someone to sort of give them the lay of the land as they came to Detroit. I pitched some neighborhoods that I thought that he should go to and some people he might want to sit down with. And at the end of our phone conversation, they asked me would I take him around, which I contemplated for about 1.2 seconds and said, of course, I'll make myself available. We did a wonderful visit over at Motor City Java and Tea House over in the Old Redford neighborhoods. He got a chance to talk to some community members. Drove a little bit around the 10th precinct area. So he could see sort of the old structure of houses and what's going on now, and then Buddy's Pizza for dinner.
Which is perfect. Lastly, what do you think he was really looking for? He's been on sort of an intermittent 50-state tour.
He has.
What's he trying to do?
Well, I think, and he made this point, that he's been talking to, he's built this community on Facebook, but he also knows that there's an approach to building communities by actually going out and talking to people in those communities. So I think he's getting an idea about what people are really talking about, feeling, all of those kind of things. He asked really insightful questions about Detroit, and so we'll see what happens from it all.
Great. Good. Pretty good day. Hope you kept good notes.
Yeah,
it made it good for the book. Thanks, gang, for being here. When we come back, we'll get back to mobility. Is it time for it to move off the ground in Detroit? This is Flashpoint on Local 4. If you're anywhere close to my age, you probably grew up watching the Jetsons and dreaming of the day when you could fly around in a car. That day is actually getting closer than we imagined. This past week, Uber talked a lot about it as they launched what is known as Uber Elevate, which really looks at flying cars. And a part of that conversation in Dallas this past week was John Romanelli, the CEO of Detroit Aircraft. There is such an animal. It's based at Detroit City Airport, and it's been a well-kept secret till now, John.
Yeah. Well, we've been trying to do our diligence, prepare ourselves, develop a solution that is robust and safe and simple, and we really didn't want to come out with that.
As I said to you on the phone, though, last week, I'm hesitant to call it a flying car because while that sounds exciting, that also can minimize the scale and scope of what you're working on. We haven't talked much about electrifying air travel. It's all been gas-powered, jet engines, the same old, same old. This is a whole new world.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of benefits to electrifying air vehicles, mainly because they're not subject to a lot of the sort of environmental conditions that sort of minimize or reduce performance. Electric vehicles, like electric vehicles on the ground, you're able to give bursts of energy, and now the energy density of motors, batteries, are really making economic sense in the third dimension.
Let me explain a little bit about how this model would work then. We're talking about a couple of different parts. The car itself wouldn't necessarily fly. It would attach to something that would pick it up and take it somewhere, drop it off, and then the flying portion would go somewhere else. Is that about how it would work?
So one configuration would be more of a fixed configuration where we would have a pod, what we call life module, which would house, transport passengers or cargo and go point to point. The latest iteration of our air vehicle does have a more modular approach to it, where we can, have a variety of different payload modules that can be linked and docked to the air vehicle quickly, and you can swap out different modules for different missions.
Now, this would seem to require an entirely different, almost separate air traffic control system. How in the world are we going to regulate this world where at a certain moment a car can just sort of lift off the road.
Well, I don't think that would be an appropriate way to frame this.
Yeah, that is too.
Roadable. I don't think that roadable aircraft makes sense. I think the idea would be to have and leverage the existing network of airports, heliports, what Uber is now referring to as vertiports, which would include the top of parking garages, or
because these are vertical takeoff vehicles.
Correct, but they don't have a fraction of the noise signature of a traditional helicopter or the size landing pad. But it's very exciting just because now the technology, from an automation standpoint, electric propulsion standpoint, it's here. And it's now making economic sense.
I mentioned that this is going on at City Airport. The city's trying to figure out right now what to do with that piece of property. I think you'd love for it to have this new high-tech signature.
I think it's a great opportunity for that area, just primarily because we would have to install, broadband infrastructure to facilitate what we would call, a connected airport environment, which could spill over and benefit to the surrounding community, because there is a digital divide that occurs that is existing on that side of town.
Yeah.
You can't get much beyond dial-up network speeds there. So from that standpoint, it'll be a huge benefit to the region and would literally create new jobs, I think, but it's up to the city.
You're working on finalizing your partnership with Uber. Uber obviously sees this future coming much more rapidly, I think, than a lot of people can even fathom. How far away do you think we are from this kind of, where we're talking about air mobility along with road mobility?
Well, it's happening this summer. As I mentioned, Uber is launching an initial trial in Dubai this summer, where they'll have a pilot run, where they'll have a series of vehicles that will be running point-to-point on-demand air mobility. So it's happening as we speak. From a regulatory standpoint, the administration is clearly set towards making the regulatory environment more favorable towards new technology.
Technology always runs out ahead of where we can get the regulatory world, no doubt.
So they're doing, the FAA is doing a great job right now with the Part 23 rewrite, which really is more of a performance-driven certification process as opposed to something that was written 60 years ago, for the current regulatory process. So the regulatory process and the regulators are catching up. They realize that this technology is going to be faster than they can, so they say, you know what, you tell us why it's reliable, and we'll give you a certification. And that's why I think Detroit and Michigan and the automotive industry have a great opportunity.
Needs to be a part of it, no doubt about it. John, thank you very much. Congratulations on your big, exciting week.
Hey, more to come.
You bet. John Romanelli from Detroit Aircraft. Thanks for being here. Meet the Press is next. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Flashpoint.